May 7, 1945. In a requisitioned German estate outside Frankfurt, General George S. Patton sat face-to-face with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Germany had surrendered only hours earlier. In the streets, American soldiers celebrated the end of the war in Europe. But Patton felt no relief, no triumph. He had come to deliver a warning, one that would shatter his relationship with Eisenhower, end his command, and earn him a reputation in Washington as unstable, reckless, even dangerous. "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later," Patton said. "We should do it now, while our army is whole and victory is possible." He wasn't talking about the defeated Germans. He meant the Soviet Union. Eisenhower stared back in disbelief. For 3 years he had carefully constructed an alliance with Stalin to destroy Hitler. The American public admired Uncle Joe. Newspapers praised the Red Army as heroic liberators of Europe. And now Patton was proposing immediate war against America's ally. "George," Eisenhower replied, "you don't understand politics. The war is over. We're going home." In that moment, Patton understood something grim. Eisenhower knew the danger, but he would not act on it. That silence, heavy, deliberate, became one of the most consequential pauses in American military history. Patton had identified the Soviet threat before Washington was willing to acknowledge it. He proposed decisive action while the Red Army was exhausted and American forces stood at the peak of their power. He was dismissed by leaders more concerned with public sentiment than strategic reality. Patton's Third Army had pushed farther into Germany than any other Allied force. His units reached deep into Czechoslovakia. His forward elements stood within reach of Berlin. And everywhere he advanced, he saw what haunted him: the Red Army. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe with a brutality that shocked even battle-hardened American veterans. Intelligence reports described mass rape, organized looting, and summary executions of civilians labeled anti-communist. Entire communities vanished into Soviet labor camps. In April 1945, Patton wrote to his wife, Beatrice, "I have no desire to understand them, only to know how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. The Russians are something that must be feared in the coming world order." He was witnessing what diplomats in Washington refused to confront. The Soviet Union was not a temporary wartime partner. It was an expanding totalitarian empire. Patton met American POWs liberated from Soviet custody. They described treatment worse than what they had endured under the Germans. Soviet soldiers stole their equipment. Officers who protested were beaten or shot. Reports multiplied. Soviet units dismantled German factories and shipped entire industrial systems east. Communist regimes were installed in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Anti-Nazi resistance fighters, men who had battled Hitler for years, were arrested, executed, or disappeared. By May 1945, Patton developed a concrete plan. This was not emotional outburst. It was a strategic proposal grounded in intelligence. His analysis was simple. The Red Army had lost nearly 27 million people defeating Germany. Its troops in Eastern Europe were exhausted, overstretched, and surviving on captured supplies. Their supply lines ran thousands of miles back into the Soviet Union. American forces, by contrast, were fresh, well supplied, and dominant in the air. "We could defeat the Russians in 6 weeks," Patton told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson. The Soviets had no strategic bombing capability. Their air defenses were thin. American air power could cripple Soviet logistics almost immediately. Soviet tanks were numerous, but mechanically worn down. The Sherman tank wasn't heavier, but it was reliable and plentiful. Most important, Patton believed Soviet morale was fragile. Soldiers had been told they were fighting to save Russia, not occupy Eastern Europe. If American forces pushed east, Patton believed many would surrender or desert. Then came his most explosive proposal. "We can rearm the Germans. There are hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers who would rather fight the Russians than rot in Soviet camps." Washington recoiled in horror. The United States had just crushed Nazi Germany, but Patton's logic was merciless. German soldiers despised and feared the Soviets far more than Americans. "I'd rather have a German division beside me than a Soviet one," Patton wrote. That sentence would soon be leaked. Eisenhower had practical objections. The American public demanded demobilization. Congress wanted troops home. Logistically, U.S. forces were positioned for occupation, not invasion. But those weren't the real reasons. The truth was political. President Truman had inherited Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Stalin. The Yalta Framework governed post-war Europe. An attack on the Soviet Union would be seen as madness, warmongering, betrayal, the spark for another global conflict. Eisenhower knew what would happen. The press would destroy him. Washington would remove him. His career would be over. And Eisenhower enjoyed his status. He had won the war in Europe. Newspapers compared him to Grant. His name floated as a future presidential candidate. Why risk it? Eisenhower believed in diplomacy, institutions, and negotiation. He believed Stalin could be managed, that the United Nations could contain conflict. Patton believed in force and timing. Eisenhower thought like a statesman. Patton thought like a warrior. "George sees the world as a battlefield," Eisenhower told his staff. "He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people." But Patton wasn't alone. Winston Churchill had reached the same conclusion. Churchill had distrusted the Soviets since 1917. By April 1945, he was urgently pressing Truman and Eisenhower to push east before Soviet control hardened. He wanted Berlin, Prague, Vienna secured by the West. On May 12, 1945, he warned Truman, "An iron curtain has descended across their front." It was the first time he used the phrase that would define the Cold War. Churchill ordered the planning of Operation Unthinkable, a joint Allied assault to drive Soviet forces out of Eastern Europe using American, British, and rearmed German units. British military planners concluded the plan was feasible if launched immediately and pursued without hesitation. Churchill sent it to Truman. Truman rejected it outright. When Patton learned Churchill had proposed nearly the same strategy, he felt vindicated. "At least someone understands," he told his staff. But public opinion turned against him. By summer 1945, press coverage shifted sharply. His comments were leaked and distorted. His proposals were framed as fascist sympathy. His sanity was questioned. Columnist Drew Pearson wrote that Patton seemed eager to start another war. The New York Times accused him of political naivete. Time magazine suggested he was unfit for peacetime leadership. None of them investigated what Patton had actually seen. By September 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command. officially for comments criticizing denazification. Everyone knew the truth. Patton wouldn't stop warning about the Soviets. In his final months, he wrote relentlessly, "If we fail to show strength, we may win the war against Germany and still lose the peace." 3 days after his last meeting with Patton was paralyzed in a car accident near Mannheim. He died on December 21, 1945. Everything he predicted came true. Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain. Free elections never occurred. Communist regimes crushed opposition. Millions were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. The Cold War lasted 45 years. Patton had been right. Too early, too blunt, too inconvenient. He saw the threat when others chose